Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Women's Political Participation in the Middle East and North Africa webinar. We have our distinguished panelists who will be discussing women's political role and influence in the Middle East countries. My name is Aydin Ulu, and I'm the Director of Communications of the SAIS MENA Club. Before we start, I want to take a second to speak about our organization. The Middle East and North Africa Club at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies is a school organization for students with connections to an interest in the Middle East and North Africa region. We aim to connect SAIS students to educational and social programming rooted in cultural exploration alongside different professional development opportunities. Apart from our academic events, we also have social events. Next week, we have our movie screening activity with the director's commentary of Captains of Zaatari movie. So please follow us from Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn to get to know more about our events. We will start our webinar shortly. We will reserve time for audience questions. So please go ahead and submit your questions in the YouTube chat. It is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Liesl Hintz, Assistant Professor of International Relations and European Studies at SAIS. She will be our moderator and take us from here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Aydin, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm thrilled to be able to moderate and host this very distinguished panel of guests to talk about this really important topic of women's political participation in the Middle East and North Africa. I've been working with and have had the pleasure to work with the SAIS MENA Club over the course of the year, and this has been one of the set of issues that they've really been pushing for. So I'm excited that this is one of the topics that we're choosing. I want to highlight the excellent role that Aydin and Hayden and Samin with the club have done over the past year. We had fantastic events on Tunisia, Lebanon, and Turkey. And this semester, we're doing sort of more thematic focused events. So I think women's political participation couldn't be a more salient or important topic to be discussing. So I'll be introducing our very distinguished panel here. I do want to note, unfortunately, that Dr. Lihi Ben Shitritz is not able to join us today. She had an emergency come up at the last minute, but I do want to direct you to her outstanding work on Israeli and Palestinian women's activism in Israel. She's an expert on women's roles in religious right movements, on the gender dimensions of conflict, and specifically sort of the gender dimensions of contestation over sacred spaces in Jerusalem and elsewhere. So please do check out her work. But with us, again, an incredible panel that I'm very lucky to be able to moderate. We have Dr. Maro Youssef, who is a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California. And prior to that, she was actually a U.S. Foreign Affairs officer at the Department of State. So we have a really nice, diverse set of professional experiences that we're bringing to the panel here. Dr. Nermin Alam is an assistant professor of politics at Rutgers University. And prior to that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. And we have Ms. Azal Al-Salafi, who is a research fellow at the Yemen Policy Center. In practicing law, she's worked on cases at the International Court of Arbitration at the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris. And in 2018, she founded her own hybrid startup that aims at aiding migrant women, specifically Arab women, and we'll hopefully be able to have a chance to talk a little bit about that. So again, please join me in welcoming this fantastic panel. I want to sort of kick off the conversation. And again, I'll ask a couple of rounds of questions to the panelists, but please do go ahead and post your own questions in the chat. But I wanted to start off the conversation by sort of asking each of the panelists to sort of map the level of women's political participation in the particular countries that they come from, that they study, that they research in, and so forth. So looking at parliamentary representation, women's political activism, grassroots, party membership, that sort of stuff. So sort of a broad overview of sort of what women's political participation looks like in those particular countries. So I wanted to start with Dr. Maro Youssef and ask you sort of what does that look like in Tunisia now, just to kind of kick off the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Hintz. What it looks like today is different from what it looked like 6 months ago. So I'll try to keep my comments to the period that I studied, which is a democratic transition between 2010 and 2021, but I'll also discuss, especially if it comes up in questions, discuss the latest developments in Tunisia. So Tunisia has and had one of the highest representations of women in politics and civil society starting in 2011 after the revolution. They passed electoral gender quotas, including horizontal and vertical quotas, which is very comprehensive and often only found in Scandinavian states. And that showed. It showed when women's representation went up to about 42% in the 2018 local elections. So women were very visible, very active from the revolution throughout the transition. And they also opened up over 300 new women's rights organizations during that time, compared to two independent ones before the revolution. So in Tunisia, you saw amazing participation by both secularist and Islamist women across, different political fields over the past 10 years. Recently, we had a prime minister, the first Arab prime minister who is a woman, elected or appointed. And that is definitely a welcomed change. We also had parliament suspended. So most of the women that I studied are out of a job. They're not in politics anymore. I'm happy to speak about that more, but also, things are fluid. And I want to say upfront that I have not lost hope in Tunisia. Tunisia is a democratic transition. Democratic transitions are tumultuous. Our own here was very tumultuous for like 50 to 100 years, and we still have challenges. So I believe the transition is still ongoing, but there are ebbs and flows, and it's not linear.
Thank you. Yeah, I think looking at the sort of ways in which different time periods can vary so drastically, how are these sort of inflection points in which there's an opening, sort of a structural opening, where there's a lot of hope for more participation. And then we might see, a closing that follows that. And I think Tunisia has been a really interesting and fascinating case to follow. And so I definitely want to follow up with you on sort of the current state. I think there's a lot of polarization, or at least in our last panel on Tunisia, there was a lot of polarization in terms of what the landscape looks like, and whether President Said was sort of taking the country in the right direction, what impact that had on women's rights. So we'll come back to that. But for now, I want to turn to Dr. Narmin Alam and get your take from an Egypt perspective.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for the kind introduction. I am thrilled to be part of this webinar organized by the Middle East and North Africa Club. And I am thrilled to participate alongside outstanding colleagues and phenomenal scholars. So I study and research gender politics and social movements in the Middle East and North Africa broadly, with a special focus on gender politics in Egypt. So my comments today will specifically address women's representation and women's participation in Egypt. And when you closely look at the recent levels of women's participation and representation in formal politics in Egypt, you will notice some advancements and some reforms. But when you juxtapose this to the regime's approach and its crackdown on independent feminist groups and organizations, then you're kind of left scratching your head, looking at what seems like an attempt to have feminism, but without feminists. So let me briefly survey or share with you the recent trends and the recent reforms in women's formal representation in Egypt, before juxtaposing it to the crackdown on independent feminists. So in 2019, the current Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, he pushed for an amendment, and the amendment, constitutional amendment, and the amendment promised to allocate 25% of parliament seats to women. The amendment also included articles that expanding the 2 presidential terms, allowed for the president from 4 years to 6 years. The amendment passed. And thus, in the recent 2020 parliamentary elections in Egypt, you did end up having more than a quarter of the seats going to women, which was a historical first for women in Egypt. Currently as well, the cabinet in Egypt it includes 8 women ministers. So if you are to look at the representation of women in formal politics, you can identify some progress and you can identify some reforms. But 2 quick points on these developments. First, these advancements, they are top-down. They do not reflect a change in the broader public opinion or the gender attitudes in society. So according to the Eurobarometer 2018 survey on Egypt, you had close to 73% of Egyptians, who still continue to believe that that men are better political leaders than women. Second, while the increase in women's political participation and representation, while it is important, of course, as it marks a change in the tone of the regime, but we know that it's not enough. We know that this, add women and steer approach, add some women, but still produce the same policies, that it doesn't sufficiently address the challenges facing the agenda of women's rights and gender equality, especially in the case of Egypt and other Middle East and North African countries where the state, it claims to champion women's rights and gender equality, through increasing the representation in formal politics, while at the same time, the regime moves to target independent feminists. And this creates a very dangerous situation, if you get to think about it. Why? Because without feminists on the ground, the agenda of women's rights, the reforms and formal representation, they kind of become the pet project of the ruling regime. So in Egypt, and I'm going to conclude with this, you can speak about limited advancements in formal representation, but also an expansive constriction on independent feminist and independent women's movement, which have a dire repercussions on the agenda of women's rights and gender equality.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think that they're, irrespective of which case that you study, and my background is Turkey, but there's such a disconnect between the institutional, formal, top-down measures that are put in place. And I actually want to, maybe as a follow-up, after we hear from Azal Al-Salafi, sort of ask both you and Mauro, sort of what are the motivations of these regimes and why do they institute these reforms? Is this for international audiences? Is this domestic audiences? Is anyone actually believing that these reforms are having these kinds of impacts that they purport to have? Because exactly as you're pointing out, there's a difference between these institutional changes, legislative changes, and then, what's actually happening in real life. I'll just give a super quick example, but, gender violence and rising rates of femicide in Turkey is a huge issue. And so while there are legislative changes, there's still societal norms that are sort of permissive of actions and judges who look the other way. And so don't necessarily, apply the laws that should be applied and so forth. So I just, from a comparative perspective, I see that disconnect so much. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. But I want to turn to the Yemen case and hear from Azal and sort of what does the landscape of participation look like there?
Thank you, Lizzo. Thank you, everyone, for this generous overview in the specific cases of Tunisia and Egypt. Of course, I want to just also add something. As you've introduced me, I work at the intersectionality of the law, human rights, and entrepreneurship, with a focus of migration, as you've mentioned. Most recently, I've been working with Yemen policy on women, their political participation and protection pathways. And in the case of Yemen, of course, we can see their powerful role, more in civil society efforts than their official roles in the government. In official roles, participation has been low, and that has been the case for a really long time. And it continues, unfortunately, to decrease. But that doesn't mean that they are not non-existent. They actually took a very important part in the UN brokered National Dialogue Conference, making up to 27% leadership representation. They called for 30% to 50%, including the youth, to women's participation in all levels of government. Which have passed, despite some oppositions of religious groups. They also made up to 12% of delegates in Kuwait talks in 2016 and 4% in 2018 in the Stockholm Agreement. We can see the decrease here in number. And also the latest form, legitimate government, despite the noticeable efforts that women have been making over the past 8 years during the ongoing conflict, they still remain marginalized and they're not representative. They're not represented in the current government. But women have been calling since 2001, I believe so, during their activation for the UN resolution of 1325, so that Yemeni women can play an active role in an influential role in society. And unfortunately, it is the case until now. We have not received any. We have not done any milestones so far, but as I said, we certainly see more women in civil society working across political and sectarian lines to influence the peace process, including through the Yemeni Women Pact for Peace and Security. We also have the Peace Track Initiative, who work on a feminist roadmap towards peace. So we might not see them on the chair at the moment, but they're actually very profoundly taking huge footsteps on ground to impact change in all aspects of Yemeni life. This, unfortunately, however, comes with a price too. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I actually want to direct a question back to you and kind of pick up on this role of civil society that then we'll discuss with some of the other participants as well. But sort of what would you say are the main channels for participation in terms of civil society? Are there formal organizations? Are there sort of more casual grassroots social networks that seem to form? Is there an online activism community? Sort of what does that look like there?
Of course, there are many of them, there are definitely a lot of them are civil society organizations based. So many of them work on a local level, even though they're working abroad. There is a lot of mobilization in terms of local initiatives. There are, of course, a lot of networks that are forming. My latest paper talks about that, the shadow networks that are formed by underground Yemeni feminist movements. But I think despite the fact that these exist, there is still a lot of obstacles for them to make an impact in whether the peace process or whether ceasefire or whether make an impact within the community that they are catering to. There's issues such as funding, there's issues such as a competition between them, between these organizations. And yeah, there's a lot of consequences as well. And of course, with the ongoing conflict, having two governments, one is a de facto and one is a legitimate government that operates from Saudi Arabia, which is a complete mess, and there are a lot of gaps currently happening in the structure of the formal and informal systems that are contributing a lot to the corruption of these organizations and violence as well for the people working within.
I appreciate that perspective so much. I think for observers, it's easy to kind of want to focus on and rightly focus on the levels of resistance, the organization, the civil society activism that's taking place. But we also have to understand the structures in which those take place and the conditions of authoritarianism or violence, conflict, and so forth, in which these networks and organizations and movements are able still to thrive. And so the paper on underground networks sounds absolutely fantastic, and I'm going to look that up as soon as we finish this. So thank you for flagging that. I want to turn back to both Maro and to Narmeen. First, if you want to address the question of maybe why there is a focus among these two regimes on formal rules that are seeking to set gender quotas or other ways in which governments are trying to sort of signal that they are opening spaces for women's political participation. What are the audiences or motivations behind that? But then I also want to turn, as we did with Azal, to both of you on the question of civil society. So Maro, I'll go first to you, if you want to pick up on that sort of audience of formal politics question. But then I'd like to get at sort of the look at the proliferation of women's associations since 2011, since the transition, and sort of look at what the role of Islamist organizations in Tunisia, what that role is playing. So if you want to take that first question, you're welcome to. If not, you can dive directly into sort of the role of Islamist organizations in civil society.
Thanks, Liesl. I will speak about the first question a little bit and then defer to Nermeen because I love the way Nermeen speaks and contextualize.
We all love the way Nermeen speaks.
So I'm going to defer to her on that. So like Nermeen and like you and others, I work on gender politics in the Middle East. So I've looked at different cases. I wrote a book chapter on state feminism in Algeria under Bouteflika. You know about state feminism under Ataturk in Turkey. We know about state feminism under, Abdel Nasser in Egypt. So, and there's also a little bit in Syria and Iraq. So this is a pattern that has existed at least as early as the 1950s, when these states became independent post-colonial states. One reason is posturing, like you mentioned, to the international community that we are modern autocrats. we are not the backwards people that you think we are, and we are not religious authorities, and therefore we are showing you that we abide by international human rights conventions and universal notions of women's rights. That's one. Two, it's also about getting the women on board. Bouteflika in the 1990s, I don't want to say bought the secular wing of the women's movement or women's movements in Algeria, but he definitely provided a lot of progressive gender legislation that made them feel supported and like they had someone that had their back, ratifying and reforming nationality laws that allow women to pass down their nationality, gender-based violence protections, more citizenship rights, protecting the personal status code. These are all things we've seen across the countries that we work on. And that's one way that leaders signal their commitment to women and try to consolidate power through the women vote. Why did President Kais Saied appoint a female prime minister? I don't know, but it is definitely a signal, and she's the first in the region. He also met with ATFD, the oldest feminist organization, as soon as he made his power play in July. So the fact that they got FaceTime with the president, who doesn't meet with a lot of people, is important to note that he is signaling, you are part of this process, you will not be left out. And segueing into Islamists, ATFD and other secularist feminists in Tunisia have worked very, very hard for women's rights that they have today. And they felt like they had to fight tooth and nail for those rights, to keep those rights and to increase those rights over the past decade, 11 years. They saw Islamists as the threat to take that away, everything that they've gained since 1965. Is that true? Potentially, but we know that perception of threat is very, very important when it comes to mobilization. And these women work tooth and nail to make sure that they didn't lose their rights. What did Islamist women do to segue into that? They formed a lot of organizations for the first time. They were allowed to come up for air and breathe and mobilize. Something they were very successful in working on is transitional justice. They and their relatives and their friends and their loved ones were mostly the victims of those kinds of abuses under the Ben Ali regime and the Bourguiba regime. So they mobilized a lot. So we had Tunisiyet was one organization that was very visible on this issue, and Nisa Tunisiyet, another one. They both worked with the Truth and Dignity Commission and helped basically bring testimonies to their door and say, here you go, these women are willing to come forward and discuss all the abuses and the horrendous things that they experienced under dictatorship. So they were successful, at least on that issue. They also helped push for the gender quotas at some point because Islamist women benefited the most in politics from the gender quotas. Nahda elected more women than anybody else. So they trained Islamist women before they got into office, while they were in office, and they worked with them on these legislation pieces and talked to them. I mean, I've seen them send them edits on the gender-based violence law on the draft to say, take this out, clarify this. So that's something that they were able to work on. They worked on different issues. There was a lot of resistance at the beginning to accept the language of women's equality to men. That was a very big battle that I would say secularist women won. And Islamist women adapted and reframed their messaging and accepted that language. By the time I was conducting interviews in 2014, they were explicitly discussing women's equality. Women's complementarity never came up. Whereas 3 years earlier, it was all about women's complementarity and how that's the way forward. So Islamists made some contribution to the transition, but there was also a lot of adaptation. And I do thank the secularist wing of the women's movement for that they would serve as a checks and balance. No, this is not an Islamic state. We need to adjust. We need to come to a compromise. Yeah.
So everything that you raise is so fascinating in so many ways, but for me, because I see so many parallels with Turkey in terms of sort of Islamist parties' strategies for mobilization, particularly sort of the vernacular politics that Jenny White writes about in terms of really mobilizing grassroots activism through women, getting them into the party, showing them that they can have a role and so forth. And, the extent to which there can be sort of idea overlap amongst, say, secular and Islamist activist groups, I think is something that we haven't necessarily seen yet in Turkey. There still seems to be sort of a polarization around these discourses. So it was really interesting that you're sort of talking about complementarity. In Turkey, the discourse is either sort of gender equality or gender justice, and they have very different sets of sort of expectations of what they're pushing for. So I really appreciate that perspective. So Narmeen, I want to turn to you. I see you as sort of an expert on state feminism. So if you want to sort of address the questions of the motivations around pushing for sort of institutional changes, we'd love to hear from that. But I'd also love to turn to the question of women's activism in Egypt, specifically during the uprising, during the revolution, which I know that you've done quite a lot of work on, and kind of speak to the role of women's organizations in either doing the mobilization of getting people in the street, of sustaining that, sort of what women's roles looked like during the revolution.
I mean, my colleague, Professor Maru Youssef, Dr. Maru Youssef, she definitely covered it eloquently with her explanation of the different and the cross-cutting factors. So I have little to add, honestly. Thank you, Maru. It's as usual, excellent analysis. It's definitely cross-cutting factors, or if I am to speak to the case of Egypt, these are definitely cross-cutting factors that are situated within not only the national politics and the national contestations of the country or the state, but it's also situated within what is trending on the global agenda, basically. So you would have some phases, you would have some periods in Egypt where it was advancements in women's rights was tightly attached to receiving foreign aids, or was tightly attached to foreign policy agendas. So you can definitely see this polishing the image of the regime in front of Western audience and in front of Western funding agencies. But also, I think it was also the outcome of women's activism that was co-opted by the regime and was, produced and shown by the regime as form of a grant for women, rather than that it was the outcome of women's activism. And as Maru was discussing, I think Islamist politics is also a big part of it. So if you are to look at the current regime agenda in Egypt, I think a big part of it is motivated by distancing themselves from the Islamic political parties and Islamist politics, and giving these grants in a sense of women's right in order just to distance themselves from the political Islam that preceded them. On the second question, I think one way to think and to assess the role and the consequences, I would also say, of women's participation in the uprising is to look at the change in formal politics, to look at the change in institutions, and to look at the change in the movements. And when you look at these institutional and policy changes, as I mentioned, you're going to see that that similar to other reform groups, women groups, they participated in ousting the Mubarak regime in 2011. Women groups also during the transitional period, they played an important role in exposing the contradictions of different political parties and the atrocities committed by the army against protesters. And during the Muslim Brotherhood, women groups documented and exposed the Brotherhood's blunt attack on the agenda of women's rights and gender equality. And they did so through direct street action, through participating in writing the Constitution, and preparing and training women to run for elections at the different levels. And the end result now, I think, is that due to this also activism is that you're having more women in the parliament, is that you're having more women in high government positions, which I think is also partially the outcome of women groups' work during the uprising, but it's also a reflection of the regime's current agenda. Another very important and significant aspect of women's participation in the 2011 Egyptian uprising is the wrenching emotional encounters with gender-based violence. During and following the uprising, the regimes in power, whether it was the army, the Muslim Brotherhood, they targeted women protesters through the use of sexual violence and sexual assaults. They targeted them to exclude women from the public space and from the political landscape. However, through women's participation in collective action, participants, however, they rendered questions surrounding women's bodily rights, the questions that were traditionally held to be private, they rendered it public and political in the aftermath of the uprising. And thus you have in 2014, you see for the first time ever in Egypt, you have Egypt passing the anti-harassment law. And for the first time in Egypt, you kind of have a national machinery to address the issue and to report on the issue. And no regime, like rarely would you have a regime that would come out, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, that would come out and say, I responded to activists and I responded to, the people shouting in the streets. But you cannot divorce these reforms from women's activism during the uprising. At the heart of these reforms is women's activism and collective action during the uprising, and their work in exposing violence, particularly gender-based violence and sexual harassments and sexual assaults against women. And finally, and quickly, another important, and that's my favorite new project now is, a less highlighted aspect of women's participation in the uprising and the consequences of their participation in the uprising is to look at their biographical, the biographical consequences of their participation. At the most basic level, the experiences of women challenged and continue to challenge society's conformity to taken for granted concepts and taken for granted authorities and even life courses, and opens them up for debate. And we don't always win these debates, but at least we push them into the spotlight. And by doing so, the legacy of women's participation and the role in the uprising, I think, continue to live on currently in Egypt.
I think the role of emotions is so important in studying protests. And I know that's something that you've been working on with the project as well, and thinking of the emotions that are mobilizing people in the moment and keeping them in the square and so forth, but that are affecting particularly women who've been victims of sexual violence, of gender-based violence, and how that may be part of a movement that leads to continued mobilization, pushing the regime, demanding changes and so forth. I really appreciate the way that you've framed how much the fact that an authoritarian regime would say, yes, we've made these changes, like that, you've raised a really important point, which I hope the audience recognizes, is like that's pretty unprecedented, right? To recognize and acknowledge the role of protesters and activists in enacting change. Usually it's a regime that sort of takes credit for it itself and spins it in a particular way, as not to embolden protesters to push for further concessions and so forth. So it's really a testament to the work that the women have done. I want to pick up on that theme of sort of the intimidation and turn to Azal and talk about the role of the regime and the security apparatus in methods of intimidation, strategies of political intimidation, violent intimidation, and what strategies women organizers or those who are mobilizing around gender politics have engaged in to avoid the intelligence apparatus, the security apparatus, and so forth. Can you speak a bit to that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, Dr. Nermeen and Dr. Mara, they've already, I think they spoke about not only Egypt or Algeria or Tunisia in specific, they're speaking in general of the situation of women in politics in the MENA region as they suffer. And women are doing activism despite the changes of their role, despite whether they're journalists, whether they're activists, whether they are lawyers, whether they are peace builders, however you want to call it. I just want to re-inform a little bit in terms of understanding the whys. It's all about information. So if information that these autocrats or these governments are withholding it, they do not want to be exposed. So then information becomes intimidating for them, and that's what they're trying to fight. And human rights activists are the information, are the source of information. And so when we think about as well information in particular, we think of it as a bellwether for the health of the democratic norms and the enjoyment of human rights, online and offline within a country. And when these spaces for freedom of expression, opinion, and tolerance become absent amongst the society, violations of these freedoms of press, expression increases. And that has been the case, unfortunately, in Yemen. Yemen is one of the worst environments for human rights for women and journalistic work around the world. It ranks at 167 out of 180 countries, with a total decline in freedom of opinion and expression as a result of the ongoing conflict. The facts and figures, unfortunately, of the current ongoing violations against human rights, the dire humanitarian situation, I would call it, exposes probably only 1% of what's been undocumented and censored realities of the millions of Yemenis. However, the protection, the security aspect is guaranteed in the states. The freedom of thought, freedom of expression, whether verbally, in writing, photography, it is, however, within the limits of the law. So this is the question that we often ask. That's always a remark, like, what does within the limits mean? How is it interpreted? And for example, just a very brief example on how Yemen continues to use criminal laws for cyber crimes, for example, such as anti-blasphemy laws. These laws often carry the most severe penalties and routinely meted out by tribunals, which may violate the right to the fair trial, the right to fair trial. So this has been heavily exploited by for example, the Houthi militias, resulting in increased penalties, arbitrary detentions, torture, and extrajudicial killings of individuals and women as well. This is unfortunately turning into a phenomenon which is incentivizing activists to self-censor and limit themselves from speaking out on specific topics. Also, we have the authoritarian countries as Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates that conquer the cyberspace, which ensures the suppression of Yemeni voices and the Yemeni narrative from reaching out to the international community. We also have, let's not forget, the Western powers who are far from living up to their professed values enshrined in the human rights and international laws. Having a long-running history of arming and funding arms, weapons, and illegal funding, etc., and otherwise legitimizing abusive regimes across the MENA region. All this represents corruption and failure of systems to protect basic human rights. But what's fascinating is that despite this evident power of imbalances and the complexity of the case of Yemen, human rights activists, especially women activists and feminists, have never been more motivated and adapted and ready to fight. There are few innovative ways that they took as solutions that have been helping Yemeni defenders, journalists, advocates, etc., to continue their fight. And those are, for example, I would give a few points because there are many of them, which I find very fascinating again. But for example, we have the virtual private networks, the VPNs, for safer peer-to-peer networking that enables human rights activists to bypass state censorship and state censor regimes. We can also learn about best practices and new methodologies of accountability. We have activists who can coordinate rapidly, exchange information, and also advocate for a global audience on activities that are otherwise compromised by digital authoritarianism. We have also these networks can additionally enable civil society to develop an entirely new effective tool to spotlight on these violations against human rights activists and combat government's disinformation campaigns. As I mentioned earlier, we have in my latest article that is titled Yemen's Underground Feminist Movement Forms a Shadow Network, which is published in Yemen Policy. I talk about the shadow network and how they not only contributed to the peace process, but through their protection work, but it holds also lessons on how activists and civil society networks can create a project for a bottom-up peace building process. And it also shows how they have been able to maneuver these obstacles of the formal and informal systems and patriarchal systems and structural violence. One of the very effective tools would also be strategic litigation, which is an important tool for defending human rights and humanitarian cases in general, since the rulings of individual cases can set precedents, of course, and they can lead to structural changes in the legal system. And I would like to also emphasize that doesn't mean that if we have a progressive constitution, which is in the current case, like for example, Yemen, through the national dialogue, they created a very collaborative, a very constitution that tackles every subject and that is very inclusive to different parties. But that does not mean that inclusion of human rights in a national legal framework by itself translates effective protection or effective implementation of these laws of the Constitution, which means like enforcing human rights, inclusive legal frameworks among public institutions and civil servants is key to protecting citizens from human rights violations and of course authoritarian regimes. Also, one very crucial point which I've mentioned earlier, it's funding the right organization, the right civil society organizations that lead and defend human rights and speak the correct political narratives that represents the different groups in Yemen. And yeah, basically, there's also the issue of political accountability that needs to always be addressed and monitored. And more or less, there are organizations at the moment, civil society organizations that are currently working on this path. So overall, it is important to invest in grassroots and local community organizations and also academia, let's not forget, because they have tremendous capacities to make changes in terms of the narratives and the facts that's happening in the country. And last but not least, solidarity and mobilization from different neighboring countries in the MENA region, because they do make an impact. It's a fight of the Yemenis, we understand that, but this solidarity makes them continue this fight.
I am so grateful that we have a legal expert on this panel to be able to highlight the role of strategic litigation and sort of be able to highlight the ways in which women are contributing. And I think that's especially important if we consider that maybe, that women have been perhaps marginalized from the formal ongoing talks in terms of participation, but that they are playing such a crucial role in these different spaces. So I really appreciate that. Before I turn to Maro, because I do want to sort of ask the question of what does the space look like for gender equality now under the current situation? I'll give a little bit of context as to what our last panel on Tunisia looked like when I asked the question, but there were those who were very, very hopeful that the current president still had gender equality on the agenda, and there were those who were quite not hopeful about that. So I'll turn to Maro. But quickly, Azal, we have a question from the audience. And again, please continue to post your questions in the YouTube chat. And this is sort of more of a bit of a mapping of feminisms in Yemen. If you could kind of quickly describe or sort of lay out what are sort of the ideological or identity divides when it comes to feminism in terms of secular and Islamist or sectarian, or sort of what does that look like in the Yemen case? That's a whole book, I know, yes. Right? And I'm asking, like, give it to me in 2 minutes.
Of course. I mean, just to think about the word feminism it sounds like a threat to not only politicians or like religious groups in Yemen, but also to the society, because there's some sort of stigma that arises behind the role of feminists or feminists. What are they? Are they breaking taboos? Are they breaking traditional norms, gender roles? What are they doing exactly? And they do not understand that as far as I have seen, and as far as I've interviewed, and as far as I've read and have been very involved with these feminists, they actually take on a much more an intersectional feminist approach, which means including all those who have been previously marginalized, all the immigrants that have been in Yemen, all the internally displaced women, internally displaced people, of the LGBT community as well, that is until this day is frowned upon. Of course, they can never be part of a political agenda or a political negotiation. So this, of course, in itself, it's still in the beginning. It's still being advocated for, and meanwhile they're taking gradual yet steady steps towards these reformations, towards advocating and ensuring that it is not only the current parties that are involved in this government that are making these policies happen, or that are making the constitution work in a specific way for a specific group. No, they're actually working towards inclusivity, a whole rights for everyone, and it's not just for those who are only in Yemen. They talk about a lot about, for example, immigrants from Somalia that have lived in Yemen for more than 50 years, and they have the least right to be claimed as Yemenis at this point in life. We have also issues in terms of internally displaced people who are usually neglected and do not have a space to be part of the negotiations. Who is covering them? Who is speaking to them? Who is speaking on behalf of them? They're the feminists. So you see, yes, there are, of course, committees, there are, of course, units, but most of these focus on the humanitarian aspect and not the impact of making a policy that benefits them and benefits their rights. So I think they are not only guiding this new framework that assists the current organizations, the current civil society organizations, that assist the parties that are currently moving forward towards peace building. They are actually making sure that they are taking these steps for these people, taking these steps for those who are not underrepresented. And I think this is heavy on them, but you can see that they are still moving towards achieving that. As I said, they're taking steady steps, gradual steady steps, but they are, we have seen already, for example, how the Peace Track Initiative over the past year have, they created so many trainings, capacity building. They focused a lot on also making sure that there is, that women's voices are heard, not only feminists, but also normal women's voices, because not all women in Yemen have this, as I said, they're stigmatized, and so many women, they say, we want to be part of the discussion, of the political discussion, but we don't want to be feminists. We don't believe in this. We still want to be religious. And that's why it is also necessary to understand that women, despite the fact that they're feminist or non-feminist, they need to be existent in each party that talks, not only like the specific party, the Islah party, for example, or the Southern Council party. They need to be part of it, despite the different ideological approach that it may deem. You know, okay, we want separation, we don't want to be unified anymore between the North and the South. By all means, women need to be part of this discussion, because they represent 50%, if not more, from in the scene, you know, in Yemen. So I think they are still pushing, and they will continue to push until some change is going to happen, and we are witnessing that already.
So much rich perspective there. Thank you. And I think it also really helps contribute to, you know, I think something that we're all pushing for, which is to recognize the complexity of situations, and not to use sort of preformed lenses of, you know, pious and secular and sectarian, and kind of look at those who are trying to transcend some of those, and gender especially. in the panel that we hosted on Lebanon, we had Rima Majed, who gave, a really impassioned talk about the role of kind of transcending sectarianism in protests and not painting actors as wholly being defined by those particular identities. And so I think having regional experts, having those who are able to speak to kind of the complexity of how even women are interpreting feminism and what that means and how they're defining their struggles either inside or outside of that frame is really important. So thank you for that perspective. So Mauro, I've been previewing that I wanted to turn to you on this question. There, since the revolution and as you mentioned, the 2018 gender parity laws, there has been, I think, a lot of enthusiasm and excitement sort of about Tunisia as, the country that has made the most strides in a lot of areas of democratization. And I think gender equality is one of those areas that I think a lot of even just casual observers have pointed to, not as experts like you, but sort of where do you see the debate now in terms of the future of gender equality, given what looks like an authoritarian consolidation under the current president's hands? Sort of what does the future hold?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I can speculate based on
a crystal ball.
Yeah, I can. Only he knows, it sounds like. First, it's important to note that none of the legislation that has been passed since 2011 has been taken off the books. All the laws are still in place. So women can still benefit from these laws. One thing we saw that was promising was during the early phases of the COVID pandemic. I wrote a piece on this with Sarah Yerkes in Middle East Law and Governance. We saw a rapid response to increased concerns about gender-based violence and especially intimate partner violence during COVID. And there was a response from the government, the presidency and parliament at the time, where they established more hotlines and they established a shelter. So we are still seeing some positive steps. And that was important, and I'm going to credit that to feminist organizing dating back to the 90s in Tunisia. If feminists did not do all this groundwork, and then Islamist and secularist women did not work on the issue and build consensus around the issue, it wouldn't be so easy to pass in a polarized time. Now, in terms of women's political participation, I'm not sure what's going to happen. The civil society is very split, as you mentioned, because both sides have their grievances. Some support Said because of poor governance over the past decade and because of the threats against women's rights, to curtail women's rights. And some support Nahda and think that they and other political parties are being crucified right now during this time. So what will be important, like we saw in 2013 with the political crisis, civil society has to come together. Women have to come together. If they can't, then there is really no one left to check these changes and this power grab. The latest discussion that we saw a few days ago was about how they might modify or amend the NGO law that was very progressive, that allowed the mushrooming of civil society and allowed this very beautiful, safe space of mobilization. They might change it. And now it's limiting civil society, as we've seen in many of these countries. But one of the key components now is civil society cannot receive foreign aid without government permission. And that's very concerning because all of these organizations have been funded by foreign donors. They cannot stand on their own. If they get any funding from the state, it's very minimal. So maybe this will be the issue that pushes civil society to move and to work together. Perhaps, I don't know. But without a collaborative effort by different political parties and different women across the political and ideological spectrum, things will not change. And that's what I'm worried about. So the laws will stay on the books. Whether or not they will be fully implemented is to be determined, but women need to protect their place in politics like they have done over the past 11 years. And that's one way to do it. But it's hard when you have deep mistrust. It's very difficult. It's asking Republican and Democrat women here in the US today to work together. which I don't think will happen. But it happened in Tunisia before, so I have hope.
Yeah, it's amazing how divides that are produced through conflict or that are produced through political struggle can endure in such ways. I mean, I think about I love the example of Democrats and Republicans in the US, and even the Women's March, in right after Trump was elected, right after his inauguration, there was a lot of policing of who belonged at a women's march, and like, if you're pro-life, do you belong at a women's march? If you're pro-choice, do you belong at a women's march, and so forth. So overcoming those divides, and especially if you've been pitted on opposite sides in previous political struggles, is incredibly difficult to do. So we've come to the end of our time here. I want to thank you so much for all of your participation. This has been an incredibly rich discussion. Narmeen, Azal, Maro, I know that our audience is incredibly thankful for the insights that you've brought, for the regional expertise, for the really rich discussion, and for, I think, perhaps what's most important is sort of the amplification of the roles that women are playing. I think often when we sort of think about women's political participation in the Middle East, we think about the challenges to it. And obviously those challenges are massive. But as you've demonstrated, women are finding creative and alternative strategies and platforms and ways of networking and getting involved and making their voices heard. So thank you for presenting an incredibly rich discussion. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And